What's going on, everyone? So there is going to be a bunch of pretty competitive official Star Wars Unlimited tournaments coming out soon, the planetary qualifiers, and I figured now's a good time to talk about what I consider to be the top 5 decks in the format. Now, of course, this is based on not just my experience, but also a lot of research into all the cash tournaments and competitive events that we've had so far. And heck, I'm going to talk about the top 5 what I consider meta decks, but even within those decks themselves, the amount of cards or the amount of copies of a certain card or a card in general could be completely omitted from some version of the deck, and in another version it's like the most important card, even if you're playing the same leader and same aspect combination, just based on what we've seen from the tournaments themselves. So just keep a little bit of a grain of salt when we're talking about this. But if you were to go with any of these leaders to a planetary qualifier, I would say you have the best chance out of any leaders or set slash aspect combinations out of all of Star Wars Unlimited. So let's dive into it. And a quick shout out to my patrons. We've been chatting a lot in Discord, and I'm setting up some viewer games, which is going to be pretty exciting, as well as I have a TCG player link in the description down below to pick up any of the cards that you might want to see in your decks for the top 5 here, if you don't have them already. The first list we're going to be going over is Sabine Green, and we will have all 5 of these deck lists down below. And remember, there are all sorts of variations on all of these lists. So if you want to make one modification that you think is going to perform better in whatever meta you're playing in, that is absolutely something that you should be doing. We're going to be going through all kind of the cards in the deck for the most part, or at least play styles, and some of the key factors of every single deck that you're going to want to be paying attention to. Starting off with Sabine, Energy Conversion Lab is by far the most important card in this deck. And I've talked about this a lot, but really the only 2 cards you most frequently should be using them on, if almost always, is Poe Dameron and Wrecker. There are some times when you use a K2SO ECL, and very rarely you'll use one of these earlier drops that you're going to ambush out to get some sort of really important trade. But the reason why this deck is so powerful, and the reason why, at least in my opinion, it's going to give you the most consistent and high placing results, is because of the Energy Conversion Lab combined with the aggressive nature, while also leaning towards a little bit more mid-range, because you have these 5 and 6 drops that can give you immediate value because of the ambush aspect of them. Poe Dameron potentially just killing an opponent's unit or guaranteeing damage or removing upgrades. Wrecker guaranteeing a bunch of damage to your opponent's base while killing something. These are really important things to keep in mind. The rest of the deck is sort of a rebel aggro deck that you're kind of used to seeing from set 1. You're trying to get early plays in and have a play for every single turn of the game. Usually something like a Battlefield Marine into a Fleet Lieutenant, or a Battlefield Marine into a Red 3 or Wing Leader, where you're trying to, well, get in guaranteed damage. Fleet Lieutenant, a great example of this. You play your Battlefield Marine, you play Fleet Lieutenant, you immediately attack their base for 5. Normally, you want to avoid attacking your opponent's units because you are oftentimes going to be using Sabine's action every single turn. Not every turn, but most of the turns you're going to be using the Sabine action. So that already kind of sacrifices a little bit of the ability to take the initiative, because you're heavily leaning towards using that action. And so you want to try to shortcut those plays as much as possible, right? Trying to attack immediately, not attack your opponent's units. Make your opponent use their actions to hit your units so that you might have the ability to take initiative. In some cases, you're going to be using some of your early drops like Sabine Wren, for example. Sabine Wren attacking your opponent's 2-3, which will kill it and keep your Sabine Wren alive, could be pretty relevant. If they play another Sabine Wren or a Colonel Yularen, for example, attacking their units can be more valuable than attacking a base, because they can't set up any official synergy with the Yularen, or they can't kill your Sabine Wren with theirs and keep theirs alive. In terms of a couple other things that you want to keep in mind is the events and upgrades that you're running. Now, most decks are going to be running the full 3 of 4 cause. This is a card that you almost never want to resource unless you're kind of in a very aggressive oriented matchup. And in that case, you may not have enough time to get the 4 causes down. But this is a way you can get sort of the guaranteed 4 damage. In this list, it's not guaranteed 4, but it's most frequently going to hit for 4 damage, if not 3. The Rebel Assaults can help you break the mirror, getting in for immediate damage and actually using up those actions. Again, a lot of this game is about action economy. You're trying to limit the amount of actions that you need to take to kill your opponent, and Rebel Assault can help with that. Same with Heroic Sacrifice, just guaranteeing a bunch of damage in a single swing. The cards that kind of vary the most are going to be the Timely Interventions and Dark Sabers. Time Intervention is a card that kind of leans you more in the mid-range direction, where you're trying to, again, ambush out things like Podameron, Wrecker, and K2SO for massive value in the middle stages of the game to help you close it out. Dark Saber is a card that you really want to be careful about playing. In some games, this is going to be one of the most important cards in your whole deck. You're going to play it on a Sabine Green flip turn. When you get that 4 resources, you put a Dark Saber on it, and it's really tough to deal with. And in other games, your opponent's going to have Disabling Fang Fighters, Bamboozles. They're going to have ways to defeat upgrades or ways to kill your Sabine Green, and that use of resources has been completely negated alongside killing your leader or heavily limiting it, which is really, really unfortunate. So know the matchups that's really good in, things like Han Blue, and know the matchups that is pretty bad in, which is like Han Yellow, for example. New Han Blue and old Han Yellow, I should say. Another thing that you're going to want to note is some cards for the sideboard. What you're really looking for is, well, kind of doubling up on your Spec Force Soldier. This is kind of an unassuming card, but it's really important for certain matchups. If they play an early Obi-Wan, they play an early Childson, the ability to bypass that is extremely important, because oftentimes your opponent's going all in on that Sentinel to prevent that damage. And if you're able to bypass that, that can really mess up the math and completely throw your opponent off. So we have more of those in the sideboard. We have another Rebel Assault, mainly for the Mirror Breaker, where you want to just get in as many attacks as you possibly can, as quick as you can. More Disabling Fang Fighters for when your opponent is maybe heavily relying on upgrades. Entrenched, Frozen in Carbonite, the Dark Sabers. Fighters Freedom can help you get past certain shielded units. For example, the Client can be a really nice way to add Fighters Freedom back in, because you can defeat that shield and actually attack your opponent's Client, or just a way to get in extra guaranteed damage when you play red units. So it can be pretty good in those matchups. And lastly, U-Wing Reinforcements. Now, ironically, this is the most tricky card to sideboard in, because when you're looking at this card, this is not a card where you want in just straight up matchups that are going to go into the late game, right? In some cases, that can be pretty good, and in some cases, that can be pretty bad. Some matchups, you want to go under your opponent, and what that means is you want to be as aggressive as possible. So you don't want to be getting into the late game with your opponent. And in some games, like let's say you're playing against Boba Green, for example, your deck can actually compete in the late stages of the game with a Boba Green deck, and U-Wing Reinforcements can actually be pretty good there. Just remember, you are the aggro mid-range deck, so you have the ability to sideboard way more mid-range, but also sideboard way more aggro as well. Know which way it's better, and depending on which matchup. The next deck list on the docket is Boba Yellow, and I'm sure a lot of you were expecting this list. This is by far the most impressive leader overall in Star Wars Unlimited in terms of their results, but also it's just still been absolutely amazing in set 2. The ability to leverage these additional resources is just so powerful to get you ahead on board while also disrupting your opponent. And that's what you'll hear me talk about a lot, because this is not the only tempo-oriented list. But the idea behind these tempo decks, usually when you're playing yellow, the kind of aspect identity in Star Wars Unlimited is all about early advantage for late game kind of cost. And so the idea is you want to put on early pressure for your opponent and follow that up with kind of disrupting your opponent's response to that early pressure. And so what you'll see is a lot of our early units are just units that kind of stay alive and stick around and be annoying. And then we kind of have a mix of other units that are going to disrupt our opponents, and a lot of events that do that as well. The first thing you're going to have to know about Boba is the fact that this guy is an absolutely absurd flip. And what I mean by that is we have a 5 resource flip for a 4/7 body. It's very tough to deal with a Boba Fett leader flip on the turn that you can flip Boba. There are a few ways. Sabine Green does have a way to deal with it in ECLing out a Podameron, so you do have to be wary of some things, but usually just flipping this guy is a pretty safe play, and it's going to be really tough for your opponent to deal with, and it can kind of help you just get in a bunch of damage. But the way this deck really starts to see some impressive showings is when you can leverage the additional resource you get by making an opponent's unit leave play. Now, you don't normally want to do this by just attacking it with your own units that you played on the previous turn, because those units are usually trying to get in damage to your opponent's base. There are exceptions to this, but our early units such as Greedo, Crafty Smuggler, Viper Probe Droid, these units are played early on alongside Cartel Spacer to try to get in damage to your opponent's base. The one exception is going to be Crafty Smuggler. Since it's a 2/2 shielded, it can attack your opponent's units with some help with events, killing them and then staying alive because of that shield aspect. In our 3-drop slot, we actually have some really high toughness units in Toro Calican and Boba Fett, while also having a disruptive unit in Bodhi Rook. Following the turn 1 play up with one of these units, either Boba Fett, Toro, is going to be really hard for your opponent to actually kill off. And in Bodhi's case, it's going to not only put pressure on the board, but also actually disrupt your opponent's hand. If they're relying things on Power of the Dark Side, Overwhelming Barrage, this could be a pretty powerful play on turn 2. After which, going in for your 4-drops in like 4-LOM that to help you kind of ambush and kill something, and again, get that resource back, can actually allow you to play things like Greedo following it up because you'll get 1 back or even one of the cheaper events. And that's something that's really, really important to realize is all of these units are kind of meant to get in damage to your opponent's base or do something immediately when they're deployed to the board. For example, Cantina Bouncer not only gives you a 3/5, but also disrupts your opponent's ability to actually kill your earlier units and leverage the additional resource that you're going to get from it. That's a key balance, is these units must be balanced with these events and upgrades, okay? One of the most important events, or I should say 2 of the most important events in the deck, are going to be the Waylays and Cunnings. Waylays, this is a card that's good enough just to play on turn 2 after playing like a Viper Pro Droid or Crafty Smuggler, because usually you could follow that up with like a Greedo or another 1 resource play. Heck, you could play something like a Shoot First on your Greedo, kill their 2 resource play, and then waylay their 3 resource play back to their hand, and suddenly you're going into turn 3 with a Greedo in play and they have nothing, which is pretty decent, especially since you can get a Boba Fett down pretty early. A card that you really don't want to waste and you always want to have in your hand is Cunning. This is a way to pump up your Boba Fett leader oftentimes, or maybe like a Crafty Smuggler or some random space unit that's hard to kill, like a 7th Fleet Defender, while also exhausting your opponent's units to prevent them from trading or just bouncing things to their hand in order to get an additional resource back from Boba Fett. This is a really powerful card and you're really going to want to leverage this. And the way you finish out the game is usually a combination of earlier plays that you kind of mess with your opponent's tempo and getting Boba down early alongside a Fett's Fire Spray to close out the game. A couple of important cards that you're going to want to note in terms of surprising damage and surprising kind of, strikes, should I say? Surprise Strike and Hotshot Blaster are great additions to the deck. Surprise Strike just allowing you, again, to get in a lot of pressure to your opponent, get in for a lot of damage. And Hotshot Blaster, this is a great card on Boba Fett itself because, again, he's got 7 toughness. So attacking in with the Hotshot Blaster on Boba Fett or smuggling it out on a Boba Fett makes him a 6/7, which is even more scary. And it's coming down on turn 4, which is really, really scary. In terms of sideboard options, well, depending on the deck, you're going to be looking at a new adventures to potentially reset things that have been upgraded or stolen. Bazine Natel can help you really, really kind of push home some decks that heavily rely on like 2-card combos or a card that they're really relying on, like a Luke Skywalker, for example. Boba Fett's armor, similar to kind of like the Darksaber, if you are against an opponent that's playing like, let's say, Poe Dameron, they can just straight up defeat the Fett's armor on Boba Fett, so it actually doesn't work out that great. But if you're against a deck that relies heavily on sort of getting down units and trading with your units, like Han Blue, for example, although they also play Poe Dameron, but they can't ECL it out, so you have a little bit more ways to respond and can actually kill their Poe Dameron. Boba Fett's armor can be pretty good. Lurking TIE Phantom is an excellent addition to the sideboard. This works really well against any of the soft control decks. It can completely negate things like Power of the Dark Side. It can be really tough for your opponent to kill, and you can get in bunches of damage. And lastly, Change of Heart can really help steal something like a Obi-Wan or a Luke Skywalker and just kind of finish off the game. Stealing a Sentinel is really nice with this because your opponent's, again, expecting to hide behind the Sentinel, and not only do they not have the Sentinel, but you also might be able to do some random things with it. Like, let's say it's already ready by playing it last turn. Stealing it gets you an extra attack with it. They can't hit your own units, and if they want to deal with your units, they have to kill their own unit, which is pretty crazy. So it can be some really nice kind of combos with that. That's going to be Boba Yellow. Let's move on to the next one. I figured since we're already talking about tempo decks, why not follow up with the other tempo deck on the list in Han Yellow? This is a really, really powerful list and has arguably the most powerful 2-card combo in the game, but doesn't necessarily need to rely on that 2-card combo. So very similar to Boba Yellow, Han actually deploys pretty early on in the game because of his action to put a card from your hand into play as a resource. And that's really important because you could get down a 7 resource play, like Han Solo, as early as turn 4. So remember that. He's a 4/6, but really the kind of aspect of Han is the ability to play things ahead of curve by sacrificing cards in your hand. Han Yellow arguably is the hardest deck to play, at least, well, in my opinion, it is the hardest deck to play of the 5 that I'm going to talk about here, because you need to know which cards to put into your resource pile from your hand with Han's action. You need to know how to set up your future turns, when to go for the DJ tech combo, and when to kind of just put on pressure for your opponent. One of the cards that's a little bit unassuming, but again, kind of backs up what we were trying to do with Boba Yellow is L337. This is very similar to the Crafty Smuggler because it's a 2 resource 2/2 shielded, and that's kind of what you're playing it for. It's a card that stays alive and allows you to get in early damage. Now, Han Yellow has the ability to play any of these 3 resource plays on turn 1, which can be pretty powerful. Even Bodhi Rook on turn 1, which is really, really nasty since a 3/3 body is already pretty good and can rip opponents' events out of their hand or upgrades. But you also have Ezra Bridger, and even on turn 2, you could be playing 4 drops like Qi'Ra and Gamorrean Guards. The idea behind this is you want to get down early cards that are going to put on pressure and then follow it up again with disruptive elements. Qi'Ra messing up your opponent's hand, making it cost more. Cantina Bouncers bouncing it back to your opponent's hand. Things like Millennium Falcon to get in damage while you do all those things. One important aspect of the deck is that DJ and tech combo, like I was talking about. This is a combo that can be used against any deck. It just depends on what you're facing on the board and what you're facing in terms of deck list. If you're against the double green Palpatine list or the soft control list, DJ tech can be really powerful because your opponent is really relying on getting those later resource turns. And so getting down a tech early on and then following it up with a DJ from your resource pile, because tech makes it cost 5 resources and single cunning, which is really important, and then defeating that resource that you stole from your opponent with DJ, with Han Solo's action, can be really powerful. But let's say you play tech and you're trying to smuggle out DJ, and you can't defeat that resource with Han Solo because you can't get to the next turn. Well, they can just kill DJ and get that resource back. So it's not really that oppressive of a play. So realistically, you want to set up the tech and DJ combo when you can actually defeat that resource by going into the next turn and you've used that Han action. If you can't do that, then the DJ play isn't as appealing. Another thing to mention is that we are relying a lot on similar cards that we were relying on in Boba Yellow. Spare the Target is just Waylay, but if you have any bounties, you get to collect them. You could play Waylay instead of this. It doesn't really matter in terms of this deck because, well, bounties aren't really that relevant here because we don't have any bounties. But let's say your opponent has some sort of bounty unit themselves. You get to collect it, which is kind of cool. But you're relying on Waylays, Cunnings. Again, Cunning is one of the most important cards in your deck. Putting on pressure, exhausting units, things like that. Spark Rebellion is another addition that you can't play in Boba Yellow because it costs too much for kind of what you're trying to do. This is a card you don't want to be playing early. You want to be putting units into the play and then following it up with Spark Rebellion to mess with your opponent's hand. But these are the types of cards that you get a little bit later on to disrupt your opponent's response and, well, hopefully close out the game. A couple of cards that we get in our sideboard instead of what we got with Boba Yellow. Bamboozle. This is a really excellent card. We are already discarding cards essentially from our hand. I mean, we have to put them in a resource pile with Han's actions. This is not something that we're not used to, but you could essentially play a free event that exhausts a unit and returns upgrades on that unit to its owner's hand. This can do some absolute wondrous things against like Darksaber Sabine or any other event or any other deck that's kind of relying on upgrades on their leader to win. We also have things like Smuggler's Aid to heal us up a little bit later on in the game, another copy of Waylay or another copy of Spare the Target, because this is a really, really nice way to keep our, again, 3 drops alive when we play them on turn 1. Unlike Boba Fett that can't play that 3 drop on turn 1, Waylaying on turn 2 can be massive because we got a 3 resource play in on turn 1. So your opponent's gonna have a really hard time with dealing with that. We have things like Syndicate Lackeys coming down. This can be really nice. Again, similar to Cantina Bouncer, immediately impacts the board by killing an opponent's unit, preventing them from killing your earlier units, while also sticking around oftentimes, similar to Ozatec Liberator Gunship. And lastly, we have another copy of Change of Heart, similar to what we're using it in Boba Yellow. Deck's pretty tough. Knowing when to resource what you have in hand and knowing when to go for that 7-drop play with Han by attacking after you've resourced something with Han's action, getting another resource from the attack from Han, and then playing a 7-drop can be pretty powerful. But also, sometimes you can't actually flip Han because your opponent's going to immediately kill them. So knowing when you can do that, when you can't, is going to be pretty important. Overall, pretty powerful deck and very similar to how Boba Yellow plays. This next slot for a top 5 deck is more debatable than I think the first 3, but this goes to kind of these soft control lists. Now, I mentioned Qi'Ra Green here, but you can also talk about Krennic Green, and honestly, a lot of the cards that you're going to be playing in the lists are going to be similar, if not almost the same. And so just keep that in mind. Now, Qi'Ra Green can also be played with ECL and without ECL. It does change the list a little bit because if you're going to play ECL, you're looking for more ECL targets that cost 5 and 6 resources because that's where it becomes extremely powerful. But the same thought process behind Qi'Ra is extremely, extremely powerful. Now, Qi'Ra on the front side is all about kind of getting a bunch of value out of your units and also really messing up your opponent's ability to kind of control the board. That's what you're really trying to do in Qi'Ra. Playing things like Hylobon Enforcer and Pike Sentinel on turn 1, and in Hylobon Enforcers, even giving it a shield token on turn 1, and in Pike Sentinel's case, getting a shield token to it on turn 2 can really stall your opponent. You can even follow that up with like things like Death Trooper to kill off your opponent's units that maybe have been dealt a little bit damage from like Pike Sentinel. You even have a little bit of ramp in this deck with things like Super Laser Technician and Resupply to get to an earlier Qi'Ra or an earlier, well, expensive play that we have to finish out the game. And that's what this is all about. Stalling out the game with things like Pike Sentinel, Child Sins, Black Sun Starfighter, and getting to the more expensive plays. Heck, even Qi'Ra herself is oftentimes used as more of a removal card than an actual leader attacker. When you're seeing things like Boba Fett and you're seeing things like Han Yellow or Sabine Green, you're trying to use your leader to get in damage or kill your opponent's units. Qi'Ra here is almost exclusively used to kill off your opponent's units or make them weaker to your other units on the battlefield. Let's say your opponent plays a K2SO and you've, let's say, played a Resupply already and a Super Laser Technician in this game. Well, suddenly you have a Super Laser Technician on the board. You're at 5 resources, your opponent's on 4. They play a K2SO, you flip Qi'Ra, and now suddenly it's got 2 toughness on that K2SO. And now your Super Laser Technician can actually go ahead and trade with that K2SO. And that's what makes Qi'Ra a lot more powerful than initial glance. And you can also use Qi'Ra herself to maybe get some extra power on her through the grit or just trading with an opponent's unit. That's totally fine because the way we're going to be ending out the game is things like Supreme Leader Snoke, Avengers, Devastators, and in some cases Darth Vader, although Darth Vader is mainly used as the board stabilizing power. The other part of the deck, besides kind of the units in the curve, are going to be the events. And this is where the soft control part comes in. We have things like Power of the Dark Side, Fell the Dragon, Takedowns, Vigilances, Overwhelming Barrage, all of which to help us kind of get to that middle stage of the game by defeating your opponent's units along the curve. One important card in the deck is Super Laser Blast. In some cases, it's going to be really powerful. We have more in the sideboard, but this is actually not a card that you're really going to want to rely on like you will with hard control lists because you have your units. Knowing when to play this card and when not to is going to be extremely important because sometimes you're going to want to do it even when you have some units on the battlefield because your opponent's just outvaluing you. And in some cases, you never want to do this because you just curved out and your Lieutenant Child Sin's a 6/6 and your opponent cannot get past it because that will happen as well. So knowing when to use Super Laser Blast is going to be pretty important. In terms of sideboarding, one of the big things about this deck is, well, we want to be able to heal up because getting into the late game against like a Sabine Green, you can slowly start to get burnt down from things like For a Cause, Sabine Action, or even an ECL Wrecker. We already have Vigilance and Make an Opening in the deck, but we also would like some more healing. So we have 3 copies of Top Target. This thing could heal 6 damage, which is really impressive. For the upgrade focus, or maybe people going all in on like TIE Phantoms, Traitorous can be pretty good. Another Palpatine's Return. This is actually pretty strong because we will get into those late game scenarios where you can return things like Snoke from your discard pile back to the battlefield for 6 resources instead, which is actually pretty important. Super Laser Blast. This is not a card that you're actually going to be sideboarding against the aggressive decks. It's going to be against other soft control decks and other mid-rangey decks, because you both are going to want to get to the late game, and you both are going to try to leverage your more powerful cards. And if you could set up a Super Laser Blast where you can take your opponents, maybe like Darth Vader and Snoke out, where you only lose like a Long Pike, that could be pretty powerful. Relentless can be really good against the even more controlling decks, or decks that are relying on U-Wing reinforcements. And Devastators can be another copy of Devastator to kind of get some more late game value out of your deck. Overall, this is going to be a very similar list to a lot of other soft control lists that you're playing. I personally prefer the Hondo Blue. I do think Qi'Ra Green is better than Hondo Blue, but it's very similar in kind of what you're playing across the board.